Thank you for joining the Albuquerque Bernalillo County Public Library for a brief history of Ernie Pyle and the home in New Mexico that he loved so well. Ernie's house. Ernest Taylor Pyle was a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist who was beloved for his stories about ordinary American soldiers during World War II. It is Albuquerque's good fortune that Ernie and his wife Jerry came to settle here in 1940. Ernie was born on August 3, 1900, near Dana, Indiana. Very early on, he had a keen desire to travel and escape small-town life. He attended Indiana University, but left one semester shy of earning his degree to take his first job in journalism. His early career took him to Washington, D.C., where he worked as a reporter and copy editor for the Washington Daily News. He married Geraldine Jerry Siebold's in 1925. In 1926, Ernie and Jerry quit their jobs to drive around the rim of the United States in a Model T Roadster.
We do like this gypsy life. It frees you of a great many responsibilities. Gypsying is in our blood, and even today, after 250,000 miles of going away from where we are, we still couldn't bear to think of settling down permanently.
After 9,000 miles on the road, Ernie eventually returned to work at the Daily News, only to again leave his new position as managing editor in 1935 to write his own national column of human interest stories as a roving reporter. Ernie became well known for giving voice to average folks during the Great Depression. Ernie and Jerry, that girl who rides with me, as he called her, were on the road virtually nonstop for 6 years, traveling the United States, Canada, Central and South America. The resulting columns were published under the title of Hoosier Vagabond. They appeared 6 days a week in Scripps Howard newspapers. Ernie estimated that they had walked 200 miles, ridden in 66 airplanes and 29 boats, worn out 5 sets of car tires, stayed in 800 hotels, and spent $2,500 in tips during this period. Richard Meltzer wrote in Ernie Pyle in the American Southwest, Pyle soon developed a great ability to track down unusual suspects by scouring local newspapers, talking to local acquaintances, and keeping small black pocketbooks with valuable leads indexed by states. In his notes on tips in Virginia, for example, Pyle reminded himself to visit Jasper Davis, known for his superhuman ability to spit 12 feet 9 inches in high wind. By the late 1930s, the Pyles sought to put down some roots in New Mexico.
We had become footloose finally to the point of just swinging forever through space without ever coming down. So at last we decided to acquire a base. Not for the purpose of settling down, not a permanent hearthside at all, but just some definite walls in a definite place that we could feel were ours. A sort of home plate that we could run to on occasion and then run away from again.
Ernie came to New Mexico with the initial intention of building a home in Santa Fe. Ultimately, he bought land in Albuquerque in an area near to friends in the airport. As he wired Jerry at the time,
Have just ordered built magnificent baronial castle on Crackerbox Row of 3 infinitesimal rooms to be ready December 1st. I am leaving at 3 o'clock before changing my mind.
W. Arthur McCullum built the new home from plans by Earl Mount. Construction on the 1,145 square foot house began in the fall of 1940. Ernie wanted a small, easy-to-maintain house with a standard floor plan. The house had to face west to take advantage of the view he loved. In a New Mexico Magazine article entitled Why Albuquerque, Ernie wrote about his choice for their new home.
We like it because our front yard stretches as far as you can see, and because old Mount Taylor, 65 miles away, is like a framed picture in our front window. We like it because when we look to the westward, we look clear over and above the city of Albuquerque and on beyond. It seems halfway to the Pacific Ocean.
In these photos, we can see the space and seclusion of the Pyles' home. However, Ernie wrote so often about his little white cottage in Albuquerque that it was not as private as he would have hoped. He lamented the frequent stream of sightseers trying to catch a glimpse of him and how he finally had to
come down to a hotel and hide in order to get my work finished. I've practically become a goldfish. If I weren't afraid of the future, I would quit this job. and raise cactus for a living. Under our original plans, we would have been in this house only 1 month of each year while we took our annual vacation. But circumstances stepped in and took a hand. For the first time in our lives, we have become householders, though we haven't stopped traveling, and we don't think of ourselves as living permanently even in our own home.
Ernie and Jerry were both in and out of their little white cottage over the next 5 years. Ernie because of his work as a war correspondent, and Jerry due to a series of hospital visits for health issues. When Ernie was at home, he built a small terrace in the backyard, constructed furniture for the house, and put up a 280-foot picket fence around the yard. They also found time to adopt 2 dogs, Cheetah, a Shetland sheepdog, and Piper, a Great Dane. Ernie's travel columns had helped him to get a job as a war correspondent. In December of 1940, he traveled to London to report on the Blitz. As in his earlier columns, he concentrated on what the common Londoner was experiencing. Ernie went on to spend time with U.S. troops during the 1942 North African campaign, the 1943 Italian campaign, and at the 1944 Normandy landings. He walked on Omaha Beach on June 7, 1944, writing a very moving and personal column about the toll of the D-Day invasion. On August 24, 1944, Ernie arrived in Paris with the Allies for the liberation of that city. After such difficult months, Ernie wrote,
"I've been immersed in it too long. My spirit is wobbly and my mind is confused. The hurt has finally become too great. All of a sudden it seemed to me if I heard one more shot or saw one more dead man, I would go off my nut. It may be that a few months of peace will restore some vim to my spirit, and I can go war-horsing off to the Pacific. We'll see what a little New Mexico sunshine does along that line."
In September of 1944, he returned to the United States to spend several weeks recuperating from combat stress. While Homey found himself ambushed by his fame. Although a private man, he had to contend with invitations, visitors, and appeals to make the movie which would become the story of G.I. Joe. One invitation came from Eleanor Roosevelt. They met in Washington and talked about their shared experience of writing daily newspaper columns. It is said Mrs. Roosevelt urged Ernie to take his reporting next to the Pacific Theater. Ernie Pyle traveled to the Pacific in January of 1945. Even in the Pacific, his curiosity about the lives of the men he covered led him to fascinating stories. The Ernie Pyle Archive at Special Collections Library holds a typescript of a late, never-published column about his meeting with Joe Gatewood, Albuquerque Indian School alumnus and Navajo code talker. Gatewood and his fellow code talkers had performed a Navajo ceremony to sap the Japanese of their strength in anticipation of the battle to come. Ernie Pyle was covering the invasion on Ieshima, a small island west of Okinawa, when he was killed on April 18, 1945. He was initially buried on Ieshima under a marker that read, "At this spot, the 77th Infantry Division lost a buddy, Ernie Pyle." He was later moved to his final resting place in the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific in Hawaii. At the time of his death, Pyle was among the best-known American war correspondents. His syndicated column was published in 400 daily and 300 weekly newspapers nationwide. President Harry Truman said of Pyle, "No man in this war has so well told the story of the American fighting man as American fighting men wanted it told. He deserves the gratitude of all his countrymen." After his death, Jerry accepted a posthumous Medal for Merit from the Army and Navy on his behalf. She also attended the opening of the story of G.I. Joe, with Burgess Meredith appearing as Ernie, and she worked on a variety of plans for memorials to her husband. But her health, long a problem, continued to decline, and she seemed to have lost all interest in living, according to one of her sisters. Jerry Pyle died on November 23, 1945, 7 months after Ernie, from complications of influenza. What was it about Ernie's writing that made him so popular? As he said himself,
"I think the whole success of the column depends greatly on that personal Homey touch in the writing. If I don't write my pieces with a swing and an ease for reading, they might not as well be written at all. Lots of times when I'm describing some scene or feeling, I try to make it sound almost like music. Often the dropping of a word or the cutting of one sentence into two shorter ones destroys the whole rhythm of it.
However, the real Ernie was very different from the person who came across in his writing. James Tobin, a biographer, described Ernie's alter ego as a figure of warmth and reassurance, a sensitive, self-deprecating, self-revealing, compassionate friend who shared his sadnesses and exhilarations, his daydreams and funny stories, his ornery moods and nonsensical musings, his settled prejudices and deepest meditations, an American everyman. Ernie felt that to tell the story of war, he had to get into the trenches and talk to the people who were doing the fighting. He became beloved for recounting the uncommon heroism of the common man. His readers appreciated his common touch. One letter he received said, "Please, Mr. Pyle, keep writing about the boys as you have been doing. Your words bring happiness to thousands just like me." His folksy writing style and focus on the common soldier ultimately earned him a Pulitzer Prize in 1944. The soldiers Ernie lived with and marched among loved him. He was right with them, reporting from a worm's eye view, as he called it. He camped with them, even washed his socks and his helmet as they did. He listened to them and gave their stories great worth. According to General George C. Marshall, his dispatches reached down into the ranks to draw out the stories of individual soldiers. He glorified the nobility, the simplicity, and heroism of the American fighting man. In addition to his writing, Ernie campaigned for the soldiers, proposing in his columns that frontline soldiers should be compensated for the increased danger of their service. Congress passed the Ernie Pyle bill in May 1944 to provide American soldiers with a 50% increase in pay for their combat service. At home, Ernie's columns were read by up to 40 million people. Biographer James Tobin called Pyle the interpreter, the medium, and teacher who taught Americans what to think and how to feel about their boys overseas. He wanted the people at home to see what he was seeing. Many of his followers kept scrapbooks of Ernie's columns, and several have been donated to the Ernie Pyle Library in subsequent years. In this slide, you can see a sampling of those scrapbooks. Here we can see someone enjoying one of Ernie Pyle's columns in his newspaper. A reader sent him this series of candid camera views which she had taken of her husband reading one of Ernie's columns and progressing from tired businessman mean to belly laugh. Ernie was the recipient of many gifts and later memorials from his readers. When he wrote about something he or the soldiers needed, he could be sure there would be a response. For example, Boston City Hospital nurses saved and attempted to send sugar for him. The article shows that the sugar never reached him because the ship it was on was torpedoed in the northern Atlantic. It was also reported that Mrs. Irwin Conger, a newspaper woman from Missouri, died of an asthma attack after hearing of Ernie's death. In response to fans who wanted something to remember Ernie by, Jerry and her nurse tore signatures off Ernie's canceled checks to give to fans as autographs. On the right side of this slide, we can see a poem that was written in his memory. Here we have another poem dedicated to Ernie, as well as a new variety of rose named for him. In his honor, the usual space for his column in the Decatur Free Press was left blank on May 1, 1945. In October 1949, Major General Andrew D. Bruce visited the Ernie Pyle Memorial Library and spoke of the day Ernie Pyle had died. The division and every man and officer in it lost a friend that morning. I have never seen men move so deeply. A deep gloom descended on the whole operation. Before entering the house on that visit, he looked to the west, to the setting sun. It was this view that meant so much to him. So what about the little white house in Albuquerque? As Ernie wrote in his article, Why Albuquerque?
We like it here because we're on top of the world in a way, and because we are not stifled and smothered and hemmed in by buildings and trees and traffic and people. We like it because the sky is so bright and you can see so much of it, and because out here you actually see the clouds and the stars and the storms, instead of just reading about them in the newspapers. They become a genuine part of your daily life, and half the entire horizon is yours in one glance, just for the looking. and the distance gets into your soul and makes you feel that you too are big inside. So if we can have only one house, and that's all we want, then it has to be in New Mexico, and preferably right at the edge of Albuquerque where it is now.
The floor plan pictured here shows the original intended use for rooms in Ernie Pyle's little white cottage, as well as the new uses the rooms were put to when the home became a public library. Here we have photos of Ernie at home and work in the knotty pine-clad guest room and study, and Jerry and Ernie in the dining room at Jerry's beloved piano. These photos show the Pyles with friends enjoying the terrace that Ernie built, and Ernie with Cheetah, their Shetland sheepdog, whose grave is on the property. Here we see Ernie at the mailbox in front of the little white cottage with a nice view of the picket fence that he built during one of his treasured, albeit infrequent, stays at home. Shortly after Ernie's death in 1945, Clyde Tingley appointed Erna Ferguson, New Mexico's First Lady of Letters, to chair a memorial committee charged with determining an appropriate memorial to Ernie Pyle. Members of the committee were drawn from influential people in Albuquerque. William Kelleher would serve as lawyer for the Pyle estate. It was proposed that the memorial should be as simple as he was, and the sort of thing that he would approve of, and that it should be something that would live and grow and be of continuing service to the young men coming out of service, going into service, and those perhaps who will form an army to keep the peace. Many suggestions were put forth for the Ernie Pyle Memorial in Albuquerque, renaming a school in his honor, scholarships to the university, or perhaps the establishment of a school of journalism at the university. Another suggestion was the naming of a hospital in his honor, a hospital which would care for the needy and people in ordinary circumstances, the people Ernie always glorified. Originally, the Memorial Committee, led by Erna Ferguson, thought to build an addition to the old main library that would hold a room for GIs to feel at ease. However, after Jerry died, the idea to make the Pyles' house into a branch library gathered more attention, especially because visitors would feel so much closer to Ernie in his home. Another suggestion from a member of the Memorial Committee, Keene Rafferty, can be seen here. Writing to Erna Ferguson, "Dear Erna, is this a wild idea? It has occurred to me that a dramatic thing would be a listing in perpetuity of the name of Ernie Pyle in the phone book, with the home address, etc. He proposed that this listing would appear above the listing for the Memorial Library." Erna replies that it might be a bit ghoulish. This legal notice of February 1948 notified all heirs and legatees of an upcoming hearing on Ernie and Jerry's wills. A partial distribution of $120,000 from their estates was decided upon on March 9, 1948. The rest of the estate would be settled upon the realization of all royalties from Ernie's books and the movie. A quote from Keene Rafferty gives an idea of the difficulties that presented themselves for the committee in acquiring the Little White House and establishing the First Branch Library in Albuquerque. "I think I can tell you how to go about the task of acquiring Ernie Pyle's house as a way to pay honor to his memory. You do not just draw up a deed and get a couple of signatures. What you need for this job are a bulldog's tenacity, Job's patience, and a lot of tact." This is a photo of Erna Ferguson and Clyde Tingley. The home was finally given to the city by the heirs of Ernie and Jerry Pyle on May 7, 1947, but it was not until August 1948 that the deed was cleared. The deed had to be signed by 27 heirs of the Pyles, including the guardian of a minor who was overseas in the armed forces. The Ernie Pyle Memorial Library opened on Monday, October 11, 1948. In order to accommodate the functions of a library, a few changes had been made to the interior plan of the house. A portion of a wall between two front rooms was removed to open up the entrance and make a large room for shelved books. The den became a small reading room. The small dining area, the home of Jerry's piano, was converted into an office for the new librarian, Mrs. Elizabeth Long. Elizabeth Long and her husband, Ben, a former naval aviator and civil engineering student at the university, had been the caretakers of the building before the opening of the library. In these two photos, you can see that the name on the sign has changed. The original sign read Ernie Pyle Memorial Library. Over the years, Memorial was dropped. It has been called the Ernie Pyle Branch Library or the Ernie Pyle Public Library. The library system calls it the Ernie Pyle Library. The Ernie Pyle Memorial Library was dedicated on August 3, 1948, on what would have been Ernie's 48th birthday. The library was not yet open. In the dedication we read, "In our present world of confusion, unrest, insecurity, this place will be conducive to calmness, sane thinking. Here can be found the inner strength to go out and meet the world, whatever the call, as did our Ernie Pyle." Evidence that the memorial would be successful was indicated by tourist interest before the building even opened. The building's caretaker reported that tourists have been taking my picture and pictures of the building every time I've been out there to fix up the place. When the Ernie Pyle Memorial Library opened, City Librarian Elsa Smith Thompson said that all Albuquerque residents would be eligible for a library card. The library was intended to act as a lending library, but did have seating space for 10 visitors. The building featured an Ernie Pyle Memorial Room and was open to tourists. In addition to being a memorial library for GIs, the branch had a corner for children. The library opened with a collection of about 4,000 books and many of Ernie's personal effects, books, columns, and manuscripts. Elsa Thompson said that new books would be added until the stock reached 5,500. The Memorial Library was open on Mondays from 1 to 8 p.m. and Wednesdays and Saturdays from 9 a.m. to 5:30 p.m. In the same manner as is employed in the main library, qualified residents were issued cards for free, while non-residents were required to pay a deposit. More than 200 people visited the Ernie Pyle Memorial Library during its first week of operation. According to librarian Elizabeth Long, 101 visitors came from all over the country, from New York to California. Other visitors included neighborhood children. In these photos from the Albuquerque Progress, we can see the walls of shelves and rooms in use in 1949. Take note of the bust over the fireplace. We will come back to it. The first assistant librarian was Elizabeth Barnett, shown here with Elizabeth Long. In the collection, 1/3 of the books were children's titles, with the other 2/3 divided between adult fiction and nonfiction. Mementos consisting of letters from Ernie and notes of his were lent to the library by Mrs. E. Strager and Mrs. Earl Mount. A display case for Ernie's notes was paid for by a donation from some of his overseas buddies. Books were given a special book plate designed by local artist Lloyd Goff, featuring yucca and volcano peaks. The Altrusa Club of Albuquerque, a local women's service organization, offered to furnish the library. The Altrusans raised money for their project by raffling a Magnavox radio phonograph at $1 per ticket. They sold about 1,500 tickets, which demonstrates the affection held for Ernie and his new memorial library. Little Marilyn Rutherford, aged 8, checked out the first book from the new library. It was called Wild Horse. The first signatures in the library's guest book were Mr. and Mrs. A. L. Jolly from Verona, Pennsylvania. Elizabeth Barnett, assistant librarian, said that the couple brought plenty of camera equipment and took lots of pictures. The Ernie Pyle Memorial Library kept up the tradition of having visitors sign a guest book for many years. These guest books are now in the Ernie Pyle archive at the Special Collections Library. Perhaps the most notable entry in the guest books is the signature shown here, which is believed to be from Jack Dempsey, the world heavyweight boxing champion from 1919 to 1926. As you can see from the photo, Ernie and Jack Dempsey met during the war. As residents of Albuquerque may know, our Art in Municipal Places Ordinance sets aside 1% of city construction funds derived from general obligation bonds and certain revenue bonds for the purchase or commission of works of art. In 1983, the City of Albuquerque and the Albuquerque Arts Board announced a $25,000 art competition seeking a public art memorial for Ernie Pyle. The resulting white cement relief sculpture depicting a soldier in combat is by Willard Schroeder. The sculpture, entitled Brave Men, is inscribed with a passage from one of Ernie Pyle's most memorable columns, The Death of Captain Wasco, written in January 1944. The passage, which comes near the end of the column, reads,
"Another man came. I think he was an officer. It was hard to tell officers from men in the half-light, for all were bearded and grimy dirty. The man looked down into the dead captain's face, and then he spoke directly to him, as though he were alive. He said, 'I'm sorry, old man.' Then a soldier came and stood beside the officer and bent over, and he too spoke to his dead captain, not in a whisper but awfully tenderly, and he said, 'I sure am sorry, sir.' Then the first man squatted down, and he reached down and took the dead hand, and he sat there for a full 5 minutes, holding the dead hand in his own and looking intently into the dead face, and he never uttered a sound all the time he sat there. Finally he put the hand down, and then reached up and gently straightened the points of the captain's shirt collar, and then he sort of rearranged the tattered edges of his uniform around the wound, and then he got up and walked away down the road in the moonlight, all alone."
An early treasure of the Ernie Pyle Memorial Library was a bronze bust of Ernie. The bust was the work of sculptor Joe Davidson, a New York sculptor of great renown. Davidson had created busts of the likes of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Helen Keller. Davidson heard that Ernie was in New York during one of his trips back to the States and convinced him to dedicate 3 days to sit for this sculpted portrait. From the sitting, Davidson created a plaster of the bust. He then made a mold from which bronze busts were cast. The bust was presented to Jerry before her death, but as is shown in this letter, was subsequently stolen from the library in 1987. Items taken during that theft were the bronze bust, a Coleman stove which Ernie had used during the war, and his honorary doctoral degree from the University of Indiana. Fortunately, another bronze cast of the bust is found in the National Portrait Gallery. And finally, we see here a tribute to the Ernie Pyle Library that appears in the book Heart of the Community, The Libraries We Love, Treasured Libraries of the United States and Canada, by Karen Christensen and David H. Levinson, a loving tribute to the little white house that Ernie built. Thank you for sharing this story of Ernie's house with us, and we thank also the people listed here for their contributions to this presentation.